Now that we've taken a close look at the context surrounding Abraham Lincoln's relationship with Mary Owens, we can now look at a letter that was written to a friend of his named Eliza Browning, in which he describes this situation, and it may bring about some surprising revelations. Orville Browning was, like Abraham Lincoln, an attorney. He served in the state legislature of Illinois at the same time as Abraham Lincoln, and he became close friends with Lincoln before and during his presidency. Through Browning, Lincoln developed a very strong personal relationship with his wife, Eliza, and in 1838 he wrote a letter to Eliza Browning in which he described the situation regarding the Mary Owens relationship. Said Lincoln in this letter, "It was then in the autumn of 1836 that a married lady of my acquaintance, and who was a great friend of mine, being about to pay a visit to her father and other relatives residing in Kentucky, proposed to me that on her return she would bring a sister of hers with her, upon condition that I would engage to become her brother-in-law with all convenient dispatch. I of course accepted the proposal, for you know I could not have done otherwise, had I really been averse to it. But privately, between you and me, I was most confoundedly well pleased with the project. I had seen the said sister some 3 years before, thought her intelligent and agreeable, and saw no good objection to plodding life through hand in hand with her." This is an interesting way to describe these events, Lincoln saying that he could not have done otherwise, and it's not entirely clear why he could not have done otherwise, or saying that he would agree to marry this woman who he had not seen for 3 years and be willing to plod through life with her. Plod being an interesting choice of words, perhaps having somewhat of a negative connotation. Lincoln went on to describe his reaction to finally seeing Mary Owens again, and he says, "Although I had seen her before, she did not look as my imagination had pictured her. I knew she was oversized, but she now appeared a fair match for Falstaff. I knew she was called an old maid, and I felt no doubt of the truth of at least half of the appellation. But now, when I beheld her, I could not for my life avoid thinking of my mother, and this not from withered features, for her skin was too full of fat to permit its contracting into wrinkles, but from her want of teeth, weather-beaten appearance in general, and from a kind of notion that ran in my head that nothing could have commenced at the size of infancy and reached her present bulk in 35 or 40 years, and in short, I was not all pleased with her." As we consider the way that Abraham Lincoln has just described Mary Owens as someone who is overweight, as physically unattractive, and in general as someone displeasing to him, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on the type of relationship he must have had with Eliza Browning, who he wrote this letter to. Perhaps they had a very close relationship that involved humor. Clearly, Lincoln had a close relationship with her because he was willing to confide in her this story of this relationship, and he had a close relationship with her husband, Orville Browning. Does this letter demonstrate a joke? Does this letter demonstrate, on the other side of the coin, perhaps a callous Lincoln, a shallow Lincoln, someone who is not willing to commit to a relationship with someone who is overweight or unattractive? These are questions worth considering, and they're up to the student of history to decide. Lincoln went on to say, "But what could I do? I had told her sister I would take her for better or worse. At once I determined to consider her my wife. I tried to imagine she was handsome, which but for her unfortunate corpulency was actually true. Exclusive of this, no woman that I have seen has a finer face. I also tried to convince myself that the mind was much more to be valued than the person, and in this she was not inferior, as I could discover, to any with whom I had been acquainted." Although Lincoln did not appear to desire Mary Owens in any way, he began to prepare himself mentally for what he called the evil day when he would be married. Lincoln's commitment to marry a woman he did not find appealing in any way perhaps shows an unwillingness to go back on his word and an overwhelming commitment to principle. However, much to Lincoln's surprise, Mary Owens ended up refusing his attempts to move forward with the engagement. Despite Lincoln's happiness that he was out of what he called a scrape, he noted in the letter that his vanity was deeply wounded. Lincoln ends his letter by vowing never again to think of marrying. After Lincoln's death, in a letter from Mary Owens to William Herndon, Owens recalls that Lincoln was deficient in those little links which make up the great chain of woman's happiness. It is ironic that Lincoln was so judgmental about Owens' appearance, seeing as some argue he was insecure about his own physical appearance. Lincoln's love life and early romantic endeavors are still somewhat mysterious, despite all of this documentation. It's impossible to prove definitively what impact these romantic situations had on his self-esteem, or his personal or political ambitions, though some historians, like Michael Burlingham, argue that they played a large role in promoting the idea that he needed to overcompensate in other areas because of the shortcomings in his personal life. While these explorations into Lincoln's life may yield no definitive conclusions about the impacts these relationships had on his public affairs, they do give important perspective to the student of Lincoln, who must now take a more nuanced look at his complex personality as a man who was torn apart by personal affairs in addition to political ones.